everyone, and welcome to the short film Q&A for Encounters Documentary Film Festival this year. My name is Hannah Fleisch, and I am an intern with the Encounters Festival. I'm joined today by Jessie Zinn, the director of the short film Wavelengths. Jessie is a filmmaker from Cape Town and an MFA candidate in the documentary program at Stanford University. She is committed to ethical and collaborative filmmaking that actively engages with the participants in front of the camera. Her films have screened at AFI Docs, MoMA Doc Fortnight, Visions Do Real, and SF Film. In 2017, she was named Mary Claire Future Shaper in partnership with Mary Claire Magazine, and in 2018, she was named a Mail and Guardian 200 Young South African. She is currently in post-production on her first feature documentary, The Home, which has received support from the NFVF and has been selected for IFP Film Week, the Sheffield Meat Market, IDF Academy, the Durban Film Mart, and the Visions to Real Rough Cut Lab. Jessie's film Wavelengths beautifully documents conversations between volunteers and callers of a women's support hotline. Her work focuses on narratives driven by women and coming-of-age stories accompanied by a subtle and beautiful style. Jessie, I'm really excited to have you here to speak about your film.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for reading out my bio. It's always so strange to hear your own bio read back to you. It's almost like, who is that person? I don't know that person.
I think it's a good confirmation of all the wonderful things that you've achieved. And it's a nice preface for this great film. Kind of speaking about your bio a bit, or I guess your film career in general, I think Wavelengths, to me at least, is similar to some of your other films in embodying the emotion and atmosphere of individual experiences. Can you tell me more about some of your interests and specific focuses in film and documentary?
Yeah, so thank you for that question. It's a big one. I entered the film industry not through the classical kind of trajectory. So I was very much a child of the theater industry, and I grew up really in the theater world and the performance world. And so I'd always kind of, once I started making films, I always kind of entered it and approached it through a more workshopped kind of like theatrical process. And that was how I made my first documentary, my first film, back when I was still doing screen production at UCT. And I think what that process like really segmented in my mind, at least as a burgeoning creator at the time, and still like where I am now, I mean, I feel like I'm always learning and I'm continuously evolving. But what it really did kind of crystallize for me was that as a creator, what interests me is telling stories and creating films that really ask questions rather than gives concrete answers or attempts to try and like, present something as black and white or some sort of depiction of reality in some concrete way. Because to me, the stories that I often explore are kind of more about the blurry and, the in-between kind of ideas that don't necessarily have such kind of clear answers. So for me, it's always my entry point into filmmaking is always that kind of point of questioning and that curiosity. And I think that does lend itself to the films that I've made also, because as you mentioned, a lot of them are quite intimate and personal reflections of different stories. And, I think that that's often also part of my positionality when I'm making these films, because I'm often coming at it from, a personal perspective that is questioning for different reasons. And so, yeah, I think that kind of a little bit answers that question. And then, yeah, I mean, in terms of just, I think, as a woman, I mean, of course, this is completely up to each filmmaker, but I do think that like as a woman and as a female filmmaker, I think also the quality of films that I gravitate towards often have a like softer quality to them. And I know that can be a generalization, but I think that it is true of my work and a lot of the work that I really respond to.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Kind of speaking about that quality, I really love in this film your use of basically nighttime as a motif, or as the general time that you're making this film, and the distances that you create and bridge, looking at the volunteers. Were there any, I know a lot of these things were probably linked to the pandemic, were there any constraints that kind of brought you to the style or kind of presented themselves as opportunities as you were making this film?
Oh, wow. Yeah. Wavelengths was just what, if there's one word to sum up Wavelengths, both the process and the end product, it would be constraint, literally in every sense. So yeah, as you mentioned in your bio, I'm currently a MFA student at Stanford. I'm in their doc MFA program. And when I made this film, I was at the time a first year student, and I was in California at the time when the pandemic first hit, and when the Bay Area, which is where Stanford is located, went into shelter in place, which is basically the California version of lockdown. And so first of all, pre-COVID, pre-pandemic, the Stanford MFA doc program is very much kind of built on foundationally on this idea of imposing formal limitations in order to generate creativity and yield creativity. So they purposefully impose restrictions on us in order to get us to think out of the box and think a little bit differently. And so even before COVID, there was an emphasis on, really trying to work around certain boundaries and limitations. And so for this quarter, this was our experimental quarter, quote unquote. So the idea being that you should try to explore something in a way that you haven't done so before in a different film. And then of course, when COVID hit, everyone was like, okay, well, this is definitely something that none of us have explored or experienced before. So there's it for all of us. And yeah, so at the time I was an international student. I was living abroad by myself. And I was just thinking through personally, on a personal level, the ways that isolation and lockdown was affecting women, and in particular, women's bodies and their mental health, and especially for those women or individuals really at large, who don't have the support structure around them, or don't have so many people to turn to talk to for support. And it was around that time that I discovered this well-known abortion hotline called Exhale that was operating in the area. And they were continuing to operate throughout shelter in place, but from the volunteers' homes. So there was this really interesting collapse of the personal with the professional, because their work was suddenly very much being brought into the space, not only their personal space, but the space that they literally are in 24/7 because of shelter in place. And a lot of these volunteers themselves became volunteers because they called into the line on the other side. So 99% of them have personally had an abortion or an abortion-related experience. And so all of these factors really just made me really interested and drawn to the subject. And, just speaking to the limitations in terms of the process, of course, I couldn't go and meet with anyone because it was April. So it was like early stages of shelter in place. So from the beginning, I had this kind of question, which is, how do I make an intimate film about connection and intimacy without ever coming face to face and physically in proximity with the people that I'm making it about, right? So I didn't really have an answer to that initially, to be honest. I very much entered the process with an open mind and with a set of questions. And it was through the process, I basically conducted a series of very long phone call. I wouldn't even call them interviews. I would say they're more conversations with various different women in the organization, some of whom were volunteers, some of whom were managers, some of whom were board members, and just trying to get a sense of what it's like to be on that side of the line, really. And it became immediately clear that, I was doing all my research over the phone, and the entire operation is also over the phone. So it immediately became very clear to me that formally the film would need to reflect that, which is this idea of connection being like transmitted through telephone wires, like literally, over the phone. And so that was the reason for having the narrative kind of be this baseline skeleton of these phone calls.
Completely. I'm really interested also in how the narrative continues after we are taken away from the visuals of the actual people and we get to see like images of the city and the ocean specifically. How did you get to those kind of parallel images with the narrative?
So yeah, I mean, I just realized I should probably talk a little bit about the night thing. So it's all set at night, and again, two considerations, the one less poetic than the other. The first consideration is that I was in class all day, and so I was unable to record the phone calls in the day. And so that was just a practical consideration. And the second one, which was really the main one, was that a lot of the phone calls that the operator spoke about, the ones that were more emotional or a little bit more tense, happened often in the evening when people would come home from work, when they would maybe find themselves feeling isolated at nighttime. I think often there is the sense that when it's dark, that is where especially isolation and loneliness tends to settle in. And then also just on like a physically metaphorical visual way, I was really interested in what this visual metaphor of the nighttime can do in terms of speaking to what I considered the work of these operators to do, which are like these beacons of light and hope, in an environment that seems extremely dark and hopeless often at times. And these women really are these glimmers of light for the people calling in. And so, when you're watching the film and everything is in darkness around them, but you're seeing them lit up from inside their homes with this warm light, I think that on a visual level, it does feed into the work that they do. And then in terms of like the nature and everything, the title of the film is Wavelengths, and a lot of the ideas that the operators would speak to me about when I was interviewing them was that it felt when the process and the experience of being an operator, it almost does feel like you're afloat in water and in ocean. And the one operator in particular, Megan, who voices all of the poetic interludes, she was the one who actually described it as wavelengths. And she was saying that, you often just don't know what you're going to expect. Sometimes it's a riptide, sometimes it's very calm. And I found this connection with the earth and nature to the content of these conversations to be really, really interesting, but also just kind of visually nuanced in a way that I hadn't really experienced other films explore the topic of reproductive rights and abortion.
Completely. Well, thank you so much. It was a pleasure to watch that film, and I'm really looking forward to your feature documentary. I was wondering if you wanted to talk a little bit about that and some of your future plans.
Yeah, so I am at the moment I'm in post-production on a couple of projects. The one is another short film. That's my thesis film. It's called Drummies, and it's about a drum majorette team in Cape Town. And then my feature doc is called The Home, and I've been working on that since 2017, which is crazy in terms of don't make feature documentaries because it'll take you much longer to make than expected. I started that journey in 2017, and it's about the largest and oldest retirement home in South Africa. And it's basically about the sort of ecosystem of the space as it relates to both the people who live there, the residents, and then the women who are paid to take care of them, their carers. And so it looks at a kind of a year in the life span of cycle, I suppose you could say, of this home.
Well, thank you so much. I'm really looking forward to seeing that. And I'm looking forward to everyone being able to see Wavelengths at Encounters. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you so much, Hannah. This was great.
I just quickly want to say thank you to the Encounters sponsors and partners who have helped make this festival happen. And thank you to the audience for watching. You can find out more info about the festival by following us on social media and checking out our website. Encounters will see you virtually everywhere.